concerning such Christian virtues as love, penitence, humility, in order to inspire obedience to his later admonitions. These exhortations, based on the citation of numerous examples from the Old Testament, are divided by a short parenthesis concerning the certainty of future resurrection. It is interesting to note that Clement used the pagan story of the phoenix in chapter 25 as an illustration of the resurrection. So one of the things that Clement is known for is using this this story, this pagan story of the phoenix, and comparing it to the resurrection. And that is, it's become, maybe at the time it carried a different, maybe at the time it was received differently. Now, because of how it was presented, and because of the story of the phoenix, how that story, ultimately what I'm saying is now that's his reference to the phoenix in relation to the resurrection is not viewed as favorably now. It's an imprecise way of referencing the resurrection. But anyway, he uses that, and that's something of note that we recognize when we talk about Clement. More direct attention is given to the troubles at Corinth in chapters 39 to 59 too. The idea of apostolic succession appears in chapters 42 through 44 and centers around the fact that the elders and deacons were provided for by the apostles, who in turn were sent out by Christ, and Christ was sent out by the Father. So you see his understanding of it. Christ was sent out by the Father. Christ called out and sent out his apostles, and now these apostles have ordained men to be bishops and elders and pastors at other churches. So he's referencing this line of succession as he sees it. This section is followed by a long prayer, 59:3 through chapter 61, in which his intense desire for the unity of the church is clear. A final exhortation to unity in 62 through 65 concludes the work. He goes on to say, this letter is valuable for its information concerning the exalted position of the bishops or elders in the church at the end of the first century. Obedience to the bishop is to be the practical guarantee of Christian unity. Clergy are separated from laity in chapter 40 of his letter, verse 5. Clement's letter is also interesting because of his profuse quotations, about 150 from the Old Testament. In addition, it contains a widely quoted reference to Paul's career, 5 through 7, the theory of 2 imprisonments in Rome, and a period of release in the interim is built mainly on this reference. So some of what we know about Paul's imprisonments and release is taken from Clement's letters. This letter specifically, Clement's epistle to the Corinthian church. And then Christ's blood is said to be the means of salvation in chapter 7, verse 14 of Clement's epistle to Corinth. So he establishes some themes throughout his epistle. And Cairns brings those out. One of the main themes that is talked about is obedience to the bishop is to be the practical guarantee of Christian unity. So, and we'll talk about this in a second, as far as the role of the bishop and how we talked about the offices of the church, or the officers of the church, I should say, when we talk about apostles and prophets and pastors and teachers. Notice that there is a difference between the offices and then the gifts, right? Because there are spiritual gifts that are talked about, and some of those gifts seem to coincide with some of the offices, right? He's given some in 1 Corinthians 12 talks about, and some are pastors and teachers, but then he talks about the office of the bishop. So there is both a gift and an office. I think it's important for us to kind of separate those two things at times in our mind, because I know at times I kind of put those things together. But it's important to recognize that when there's a talk of the offices of the church, initially it's apostle, it is bishop, it is elder, and then it is deacon, and then it is the church, the laity, if you will. So those are the offices that we'll say. And that comes through even more so in the next person that we're going to talk about, and that's Ignatius. So again, recognize that these are the apostolic fathers. These are men that existed. They were contemporaries in many respects of the apostles. They lived at the same time, but they themselves weren't apostles. They were disciples of apostles. With Clement, we see that potentially he's even mentioned in the Bible. He has if that is him, he has a fairly close relationship with that of Paul. Likely knows a lot of Peter, being that he's the bishop of Rome for a time as well. So we see kind of their, how would we call it, their spiritual heritage, right? And there are different, we can feel different ways about that nowadays, and it doesn't really, I don't really care. But it is interesting that these men have a spiritual heritage that is, that includes time. Most often it does include time spent with the apostles. So rightly or wrongly, I think it makes sense that these men, mainly because what it is that they're saying is consistent with what it is that has been said, right? Like, that's why they ought to be believed more so than whoever or whatever that they've been taught by. It is because of the consistency of their teaching with what had been established via apostolic authority prior to them. Okay, so on to Ignatius. Ignatius is the bishop of Antioch, or he was the bishop of Antioch, who opposed Gnostic and Docetic teachings. Docetism, which was similar in some respects to Gnosticism. Docetism said that Christ is a spiritual being. He was free of contamination, free of the contamination of a material body. Ignatius insisted on the revelation of Christ in the flesh. Right? So in John 1:1, what does John say? That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word of life. Right? So what is he establishing here? He is establishing, like, in contrast to Gnostic theology and the theology of the Docetism, he's acknowledging and he's saying, like, no, we've seen him with our eyes, we've heard him with our ears, we've touched him with our hands. Like, no, he was real. It wasn't a phantom on the cross. It wasn't a spiritual being. It was Christ is and was a physical being that we were able to see, hear, touch, and interact with. So he was addressing that specific heresy, and Ignatius likewise did the same. He may have known John, but he definitely seems to have been influenced in a similar manner to address certain false teachings, right? So he had a similar mindset as it related to these specific things, Docetism and Gnosticism, and this thought, this belief that somehow the material was of less importance or less of a reality than what was spiritual. And that's the heresy that he's going to address. From Cairns, and I'll read, this early church father also lays great emphasis on subjection to the bishop as to the way to achieve unity and to avoid the growth of heresy. So I'm going to give you these words just so we know and just so we understand from Ignatius's standpoint what his focus was on. So we have these Greek words of episkopos, presbyteros, and poimen. Episkopos means bishop. Presbyteros means elder, and poimen means shepherd. All can refer to what we would call a pastor teacher. So at that point in time, the leader of the church was the bishop. As I said, we would refer to that as the pastor teacher now, but bishop was what was used, the word that was used at that point in time. So episkopos, presbyteros, and poimen, bishop, elder, shepherd. What Ignatius did was show that although we have used those words interchangeably with a pastor, those are different offices, is what he's saying. So yes, bishop or pastor, the head of the church, presbyteros, elder, the leadership of the church, of which the pastor is an elder, but he's what we would consider a chief elder, or to use a different type of vocabulary, first among equals. I don't know that I really like that, but let's go with chief elder. And then poimen, which is shepherd, which is mostly related to that of a deacon. Right? So now we have these three distinctions outlining the offices of the church. So there is considerable evidence in his letters that by this time one of the elders in each church had become a monarchical bishop to whom fellow elders were obedient. Meaning that at this point in time in church history, there had already been established this understanding of elders and then a chief of the elders, and that chief of the elders, the elders being subject to the chief of the elders. Ignatius compared obedience to the elders to the bishop with the accord of the strings of a harp, Ephesians 4:1, and he urged all Christians to obey the monarchical bishop and the elders. Right? So that makes sense? So who's the leadership of the church? The elders, but the chief elder. There is a chief amongst the elders. So the elders are subjecting to the chief elders, but the church is in subjection to the elders. Does that make sense? That's what he's establishing here. He was the first to place the office of the bishop in contrast with the office of the presbyter, and to subordinate the presbyter or presbyters or elders to the monarchical bishop, and the members of the church to both. Just what I said, right? The hierarchy of authority in the church is, according to him, bishop, presbyter, and deacon. However, Ignatius did not exalt the Bishop of Rome as superior to other bishops, even though he was the first to use the word Catholic. The only superiority is that of the bishop to the presbyters within each church. Ignatius believed that without this threefold order, there is no church. So we understand, we get where he's coming from, establishing the hierarchy, those words that we gave in definition. That was what his writings, or the writings that we have, that's what his focus was on. Establishing the sort of administration of the church, the leadership of the church, the hierarchical nature, so that the church can function properly. And it's also interesting that he's saying this in an individual bishop standpoint, so that he's talking about local churches. It's important to recognize that that's what it is that he was referring to. The local assembly, if you will. Okay, so the third church father that we're going to talk about today, and there were more in this book that I held up, that I had up. It actually shows many of the names, and I'll allow us to take a look after class, but some of the other ones, it has Clement, Ignatius, as we said, Polycarp, but some that we haven't mentioned and we're not going to go into necessarily today, but I'll just have you be aware of them. Justin the Martyr, Irenaeus, who we haven't talked about Polycarp yet, that's what we're about to talk about, but Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp. So again, we do see this line of succession as far as heritage, spiritually speaking. And again, it's important, but it's not necessary, I guess, right? Like, so we see that Polycarp is a disciple of Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp, as we'll learn, is likely a disciple of John, and John of Christ. So we see this line of succession. And then some of the bigger ones that we're not going to talk about, I would have you to know, even though we're not going to talk about them, but Origen is pretty well known as far as church history and just being a thought leader in the early Christian church. Born at Alexandria. It looks like he was born, based on this, in roughly, I want to say, 2nd century, so it says about 180 AD. Cyprian, Plotinus. So anyway, those are some other of the early church fathers that we're not going to talk about today, but also carried an extreme authority and significance. They helped provide a significant, a depth of field of knowledge to the church, so that they're still individuals that we pull from today. And I just want you to be aware of them. So Polycarp, as I mentioned, disciple of John. Polycarp was less concerned with church policy and its administration as the other two that we talked about, of Clement and Ignatius. They were part of their writings were far more interested in establishing kind of the unity of the church underneath this hierarchy of the local assembly. Listen to the pastor, listen to the bishop, right? Like, that's what Clement's saying. Ignatius, the same thing. Like, recognize that, yes, your elders are the leaders of your church, but there is a chief among them. And the elders are subject to the chief elder, and the church is subject to the elders, right? So there's all that's going on. Polycarp is less interested in that aspect. He's more so interested with communicating virtue and strengthening the practical and daily life of Christians. All right, so he's more of a, and that makes sense when we think of him as being a disciple of John. On one hand, we see Ignatius, who may have known John, and he seems to be similar to John in his preaching against as we mentioned, Gnosticism and Docetism, right? Like defending the faith against these heresies, these things that do not line up with truth. That was Ignatius's point. But Polycarp was much more interested in communicating virtue and strengthening the practical daily life of Christians, which is almost like the other side of John, right? John is, especially when we see his epistles, I write unto you little children, right? I write unto you young men. It's almost a fatherly, like I'm trying to nurture and to train and to show you how to live. And it seems as if Polycarp took after John in that way. So I have something to read on Polycarp so that we have an understanding of his what he contributed. So we said that he was more so concerned with communicating virtue and strengthening practical daily life of Christians, of daily Christians. He also tried and failed to persuade the Bishop of Rome at his time to align the West with the East regarding the celebration of Easter. So, just briefly, the Church of the West, the church in the West, the most influential church was the church at Rome. And that tends to make sense if we just think about it for a second. Rome, there was a church in Rome. Rome was the capital. I mean, it was Rome, right? Like it was kind of the political center of the world. It was likely one of the larger churches. It was likely one of the more wealthier churches. Therefore, it had a lot of influence in the western part of the church. The eastern part of the church, as we kind of know already, I think Pastor Donnell already alluded to, was Antioch. So initially, Jerusalem was sort of the center, specifically of the east, but of all the church. But in 70 AD, and that's an important event in world history, but certainly in church history as well. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And unlike Christ, it wasn't rebuilt in 3 days. Like they're still talking about rebuilding the temple. Like it had gotten to the point, and this is an interesting point. Pontius Pilate, the governor, or the prefecture, or whatever it is his title was, the person who was in charge, the Roman official who was in charge and oversaw Jerusalem and parts of Israel during the time of Christ and Christ's crucifixion. His main reason for allowing for the crucifixion of Christ was to maintain the peace in that region. He didn't want there to be an uprising because it would have looked bad on him to his superiors in Rome. So to avoid that, he gave the Jews what they wanted in Christ and allowed for him to be crucified. In 70 AD, Jerusalem, it's destroyed by Rome anyway. So, 30 or so years later, that happens anyway. Why? Well, for somewhat obvious reasons. There is an attitude of, I'll say rebellion, but also of this desire for freedom, but also this desire for the Messiah, right? And understanding and knowing, like, it is not our fate to be under Rome or anyone else. So because of this spirit of rebellion, Rome finally got tired of this constant consternation in this part of the world which maybe this provides us some hope for current events. Because when we look at what's going on in that part of the world now, and we think, oh, it's World War III, they are well versed in just being what it is that they do, like doing what it is that they do there. So like don't let our hearts be troubled that there is trouble in the Middle East. There is always trouble in the Middle East. There always has been, and there will be until Christ comes again. So I would just say to bring some hope and maybe some context to that region. Like it's been that way for a while. So anyway, 70 AD, Rome says, okay, we're done. We're done here. We tried. We were very tolerant. Rome, as we mentioned in other classes, even when they took over a land, and even though they had their own type and style of religion, they were also very tolerant of the religion of the locals for reasons of peace and ease of governance. Right? Like allow them to have their own religion. Like it's not, so long as it's not contrary to Rome, contrary to the state, then allow them to have it. So this feeds into why and how we understand the justification for Christ's crucifixion, right? Like Rome punched Pilate. It's like, yeah, what does this have to do with me? It's like he says he's a king of the Jews. He's placed himself above Rome, right? Like that's how they tried to sell it to him. And that's why Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? Like who? You know what I mean? Like the Jews had set up, or the Romans had set up their own kingdom, the Herodian line. That was there because Rome allowed it to be there. Like they were, you know what I mean? Like their power they got was partially due to that of Rome. So the reason that they had authority was because they were backed by Rome. So that king, that's not an issue. But you're saying you're a king you're the king of the Jews, that you're not of that line. Now maybe there's something here. Like is this treasonous? But what is Christ doesn't answer his question, right? Like when he's asked that. And Pilate finally says, I find no fault in this man. It's like, I don't know what you want me to do. Like, this is your religious spat. This man, from what I can tell, hasn't placed himself above Rome, above Caesar, above the state. He's done nothing wrong that I can convict him for. What is it that you want to do? And why do you want to kill this man? It's like he claimed to be God. It's like, so? I don't care. Like what? But then, you know what I mean? Like it is, all this uprising, like, is about to be a riot. He's like, oh, okay, all right. And just like now, you give a mouse a morsel, and ultimately he'll want to burn down your house. Like that. I don't know how the fable goes, but that's ultimately what it comes down to, right? Like you give a mouse a piece of cheese, and he's gonna want to shoot you in the heart and take everything that you have. That's how I understand that fable. But that's what happens with Pilate, and that's what occurs with the Jews in that instance. Because, as I mentioned, in 70 AD, Rome is done. Destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple. So with the temple being destroyed and Jerusalem being destroyed, that also causes okay, we got to go. Right? The church in Jerusalem is no longer really there, at least not in the same way that it was. If anything, it's maybe a house church, or house churches. Now, the church in Antioch, which was already a large church, but that church becomes the most influential church in the East. Antioch being in Syria, which is, I believe, current day Asia Minor, maybe even Turkey. I'm not sure exactly, but I think it's modern day Turkey. So when we talk about this influential church in the east, it's Antioch, and then the influential church in the west is Rome. So, from Polycarp, when we say he tried and failed to persuade the Bishop of Rome to align the West with the East regarding the celebration of Easter, he then rejected the suggestion that the East use the Western date. So, I'm going to read what Hinson has to say about that time frame. He mentions Polycarp, but this is someone else that also has this issue. I believe this is Eusebius. Christianity evidently grew slowly and steadily in Paul's home state and in others which he evangelized during his travels through Asia Minor, notably Galatia and Asia. During the 2nd century, Ephesus in the Roman province of Asia vied with Antioch and Rome as one of the most prominent Christian centers in the empire. So see, now we have three, right? We have Rome, we have Ephesus, and we have Antioch. The revelation in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, who we're talking about, however, highlight other churches in Asia at Smyrna, Pergamum, Sardis, Philadelphia, Thyatira, Troas, Magnesia, and on the Meander, I don't know how to say that, and Charles. The letter of Polycrates, bishop of Ephesus, to Victor, so he's going to be quoting from the letter of Polycrates to the bishop of Ephesus. Polycrates is the bishop of Ephesus. He's going to be quoting him to Victor, who was the bishop of Rome at the time. Polycrates is the bishop of Ephesus, during the controversy of the date of observing Easter. He's saying this points out the self-consciousness of the churches of Asia in the late 2nd century. So by self-consciousness, what he means is Jerusalem is destroyed. Rome is the most influential church in the West. Polycrates, the bishop at Ephesus, and Polycarp, who was the bishop in Antioch, they recognize, yes, Rome is very influential in the West, but Rome isn't superior. So now the fighting and the haggling, it isn't one of, we think you speaking for Christianity should say this. It's just like, we think this aligns best. So they were haggling about agreement. So anyway, this is what he says. Polycrates reminded Victor that because they had a self-consciousness, because they had an understanding of their heritage as well, right? Antioch, well, Paul came from that church. He didn't start that church necessarily, but that was Paul's home church prior to, on his missionary journeys. Ephesus was a church that Paul planted. So these are churches that have a long heritage. So understanding this, how did I say it? I said it right once. Polycrates, Polycrates reminded Victor again being the bishop of Rome, that in Asia also great lights have fallen asleep. Among these are Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who fell asleep in Hierapolis, please excuse my Greek, and his 2 aged virgin daughters, and another daughter who lived in the Holy Spirit and now rests at Ephesus. And moreover, John, who was both a witness and a teacher, fell asleep at Ephesus. And Polycarp in Smyrna, who was a bishop and martyr. And Thracius, bishop and martyr from Eumenia, who fell asleep in Smyrna. Why need I mention the bishop and martyr Sagaris, who fell asleep in Laodicea, or the blessed Papias, or Melito, the eunuch, who lived together in the Holy Spirit, who lives in Sardis, awaiting the episcopate from heaven when he shall rise from the dead. So I say that to say this. There was, at that time, we are starting to see some differences culturally, some differences in the doctrinal focus and differences traditionally in these separate churches and these separate big churches that have a large influence. And to some extent, that should be expected. Rome was in the west, Ephesus and Antioch more on the east, and they had their cultural differences because their churches were filled with people of different cultural backgrounds. So it makes sense that they would have cultural differences. Different doctrinal focus, meaning the things that they focused on would likely need to be different because they were addressing different issues that they saw. That happens even now with, even from a denominational standpoint. Yeah, a Baptist church in the South and a Baptist church in the North are going to be dealing with slightly different issues. Churches that I hear that are on the West Coast, and I hear the things that they're dealing with, I'm like, it sounds foreign to me, but culturally we exist in different aspects, and therefore our doctrinal focus may be slightly different. And then tradition. Culturally we're different. That would say that traditionally we would have some differences as well. We draw from the same heritage, but because we drew from the same heritage, we have developed different traditions at times. And that's why it can be difficult, or it can be, difficult and or humorous when we hear arguments over, what tradition is the right tradition. It depends. If we're arguing over what doctrine is the right doctrine, okay, then that's more of a, we have more to that each can add to that conversation. But if we're talking about what tradition is the right tradition, we're in much more of a subjective area in that. So because of these subjective differences, these churches grew differently, and it makes perfect sense that would be the case. The Eastern mind is very much different from that of the Western mind. I think most of us here are much more familiar with the Western tradition because we are people of the West. The Eastern tradition is something that I know I don't have a familiarity with that much. Because I'm from the West, I am familiar much more with the Western tradition. But I just say all that to say, these churches at the time, while there were, like I said, there were differences. As I mentioned when we talked about Clement of Rome, there was a thought and there was a teaching by his respect that there is some sort of apostolic succession, that there is some meaning. There is some meaning behind the fact that my teacher was an apostle, therefore my words carry weight. Right? There was some meaning behind that. And practically speaking, I understand why. That does make sense to me logically. Just the fact that my words can carry truth because of where my teaching originated from. That part, that makes sense. But the succession part, that becomes an issue later on in the church. There's confusion, there are claims made, and there are a lot of things that are taken that may or may not be, that may be more subjective, that are made out to be objective, if that makes sense. There's these churches that have these subjective differences because they are of a different people with different cultural makeups, with different backgrounds, and therefore have a different doctrinal focus. But we tend to get into some funny areas when we attempt to make tradition doctrine. Because when we do that, well, I have one tradition and you have another tradition, and now we have different doctrines because our doctrine is based upon our tradition. So yeah, so now we start to see some kind of a bit of a tug of war, the beginnings of a tug of war that are occurring within the East and the West. Okay, are there any questions? I think I said this already, but I'll leave this up. But yeah, this goes through and this plots out history.